Hey guys, welcome back. If you're watching this right now, there's a pretty good chance it's late. Maybe you've got the lights turned down low. Maybe you're already horizontal. Maybe you've got a blanket pulled up to your chin and you're retelling yourself you're just going to watch for a few minutes before you fall asleep. That's fine. That's what we're here for. Tonight we're going somewhere a little dusty and a little sand-covered. We're going to ancient Rome. And not the fun postcard version of ancient Rome with the togas and the fountain and the charming little wine jugs. We're going to the sweaty, complicated, morally questionable part of ancient Rome that most of your school textbooks kind of glossed over. We're going to talk about gladiators. Now, before you picture Russell Crowe in that movie, which is a very reasonable thing to picture, I want you to gently set that image aside. Because the real story of gladiators, and specifically, what actually happened to them when they survived, is so much stranger, sadder, and more interesting than anything Hollywood gave us. It's not triumphant. It's not particularly heroic. It's mostly just very human and a little bit exhausting. So go ahead and get comfortable. Dim whatever needs dimming. Put down whatever you were holding. We're going to take our time with this. The story of gladiators is really a story about how a society takes a group of people, strips them of almost everything, dresses them up in elaborate outfits, and then tells them their suffering is entertainment. And then, occasionally, awkwardly, those people survive. And Rome wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. Let's start at the very beginning, because the beginning is actually pretty important if you want to understand why the ending was so weird. Gladiatorial combat did not begin as pure entertainment. That's one of those things that tends to surprise people. The earliest recorded gladiatorial contests in Rome happened around 264 BC, and they were funeral rites. That's right, someone important died, and to honor them, you had a few enslaved men fight each other near the funeral pyre. The idea was roughly that the blood of the fallen would appease the spirit of the deceased. It was a religious thing. A solemn thing, not something you brought popcorn to. The Romans borrowed this tradition, as they borrowed so many things, from the Etruscans and possibly from other Italic peoples. There are debates among historians about the exact origin, as there always are with ancient history, because ancient history is basically just a long argument between academics who are very tired. But the point is, gladiatorial combat started as ritual and slowly, over the course of a few centuries, became spectacle. And that transformation tells you a lot about Rome. By the time the Republic was turning into the Empire, gladiatorial games were enormous. They were political events. They were social events. They were the thing you attended to show that you were a person of means and taste and civic engagement. The wealthy paid for them. Politicians used them to buy public goodwill. The crowd got to feel the pleasant thrill of watching violence that wasn't happening to them. And somewhere in the middle of all of this were the actual gladiators themselves. Who were these people? That's the question we should probably answer before we start talking about what happened to them afterward. The popular image is of a noble prisoner of war, dragged from some distant conquered land, forced to fight in the arena as a kind of humiliation by proxy. And that did happen. In the early days especially, war captives made up a significant portion of the gladiatorial population. You'd have Gauls, Thracians, Samnites, which is interesting because the names of several gladiatorial fighting styles are borrowed from conquered peoples, as if Rome wanted to humiliate them symbolically one more time by having other people dress up as them and fight. But war captives were only part of the story. There were also enslaved people who were purchased specifically for gladiatorial training. There were criminals condemned to the arena as a form of execution or punishment. And this is the part that always makes people do a little double take. There were free men who volunteered, voluntarily, of their own free will, to become gladiators. Now, the reasons for this varied. Some were desperately poor and had no other options. The gladiatorial life, grimset was it, come with food and housing and medical care, which were not things everyone in the Roman world had reliable access to. Some were drawn by the promise of fame, because gladiators could become famous, genuinely, recognizably, street-level famous in a way that very few people of low status could achieve. There's graffiti on the walls of Pompeii, and Pompeii is basically just one big ancient bulletin board at this point that celebrates specific gladiators by name. Salatus the Thracian makes the girls swoon, reads one, which is both charming and a little bit sad, because Salatus was probably either enslaved or voluntarily indentured to a gladiatorial school, and the girls who swooned over him could not actually date him without significant social consequences. But he was famous. He had fans. In a world with very limited options for upward mobility if you were born poor or enslaved, that was something. So let's set the scene properly. You've got this population of gladiators, mixed in terms of origin, unified in terms of condition, living in what were called ludi gladiatorial schools. The most famous of these was the Ludus Magnus in Rome, which was right next to the Colosseum, connected to it by an underground tunnel, because Rome believed in efficiency when it came to moving its entertainment commodities. Life in the Ludus was structured, brutally structured, in the way that institutions designed to produce fighters tend to be. You trained, you ate, you slept, you trained again. The diet was actually quite specific. There is archaeological evidence from a gladiatorial cemetery in Ephesus that suggests gladiators ate a high, largely plant-based diet with a lot of barley and beans, which earned them the somewhat unflattering nickname barley eaters from the Roman public. They also drank a calcium-rich tonic made from charred bone or plant ash, which sounds terrible, but was apparently good for healing and bone density. And when your job involves being hit with things, bone density matters. The doctors, the trainers, were typically former gladiators themselves, men who had survived long enough to retire into a teaching role. They taught the specific techniques associated with each fighting style. And there were many fighting styles. The Mirmillo with his large shield and short sword. The Ricierius with his net and trident, looking perpetually like he'd gotten lost on his way to a fishing trip. The Secutor, the Scissor. The Provocateur, the Hoplimat. Each style had its own equipment, its own rules of engagement, its own visual vocabulary that the crowd had learned to read. The crowd knew what it was watching. They were not passive observers. They were informed and opinionated, the way sports fans are opinionated, with preferences and loyalties and loud vocal participation. And the gladiators they were watching were, against all odds, pretty well cared for. Not out of kindness, necessarily, but out of economics. A trained gladiator was an investment. The lanista, the owner of a gladiatorial school, had paid money for these men, spent time training them, fed and housed them for months or years. Letting them die carelessly was wasteful. The medical care provided to gladiators was, by the standards of the ancient world, quite good. The physician Galen, yes. That Galen, the one whose ideas about medicine dominated Western thought for over 1,000 years, got his start as a doctor at a gladiatorial school in Persia. So there's a strange irony at the heart of the whole enterprise. These men were owned or indentured. Their lives were not fully their own. They were being trained to perform violence for a crowd's entertainment. And yet, they were also receiving some of the best food, shelter, and medical care available to people of their social standing. Rome contained multitudes, mostly uncomfortable ones. Here is something that tends to disappoint people who revealed their understanding of gladiatorial combat on movies and video games. The fights were probably not as lethal as we imagine. That's not to say they weren't dangerous. They absolutely were. Getting stabbed with a short sword is never ideal, regardless of historical period. But the death-in-every-match version of gladiatorial combat that we tend to picture was not, it seems, the norm, especially not during the height of the empire. The reasons for this go back to economics. A good gladiator was expensive to produce. Training one to a competent level took months, sometimes years. If they died in every other fight, you'd burn through your investment at an unsustainable rate. The laniste understood this. The crowd understood this. Even the politicians funding the games understood this, because they were paying by the bout and didn't necessarily want to foot the bill for a constant supply of replacement fighters. Estimates from ancient sources, which I want to be upfront, are not always reliable, because ancient sources have their own agendas, and tendencies toward exaggeration suggest that death rates per bout may have been somewhere in the range of 1 in 10 or 1 in 5 depending on the era and the type of event. Some researchers who studied the gladiatorial cemetery at Ephesus put the overall mortality rate per fight even lower for experienced fighters. which means that many gladiators fought multiple times. Some fought dozens of times. There are epitaphs, which are one of our best sources of information about gladiators, because Romans were very into commemorating the dead that record gladiators with 30, 40, sometimes 50 or more fights to their name. Flamma, a Syrian-born gladiator who fought in the 2nd century AD, had an epitaph recording 34 fights, 21 victories, 9 draws, and 4 losses. He was offered his freedom, the rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing discharge, at least 4 times, and turned it down each time. He was free. He could have left. He chose to stay. That's either a story about someone who genuinely loved the arena and the identity it gave him, or a story about someone who had nowhere else to go and nothing else to be. Possibly both. The ancient world doesn't always give us enough information to draw clean psychological conclusions, which is both frustrating and honest. The moment of potential death in a gladiatorial fight was the moment of submission. When a fighter was wounded, exhausted, or otherwise done, he could signal submission by dropping his shield and raising one finger, the index finger extended upward in a gesture that various ancient sources describe slightly differently, but which generally amounted to, "I acknowledge that I have lost, please don't kill me." At this point, the editor, the person running the games, which was sometimes the emperor, sometimes a wealthy magistrate, would consult the crowd. And here we need to gently correct another movie-induced misconception. The thumbs up, thumbs down system is largely a post-Renaissance invention. The actual Roman gestures at this moment are debated. The Latin term most commonly associated with the crowd's mercy was missio, meaning release or dismissal. The term for kill him was essentially the opposite. What hand gesture accompanied these words is genuinely not entirely certain. What is more certain is that the crowd's reaction and the editor's decision were influenced by a number of factors. How well the losing fighter had performed, whether he had fallen in a manner considered honorable rather than cowardly, the mood of the crowd, the generosity of the editor who wanted to appear either noble and merciful or impressively decisive, depending on the political moment. Sometimes the crowd wanted blood and got it. Sometimes they admired a valiant effort and called for mercy. Sometimes an emperor overrode the crowd for his own reasons. Commodus, who we will discuss at length because Commodus cannot go unmentioned in any gladiatorial conversation, often made things very awkward by personally participating and making his own rules. But we'll get there. For now, let's say our gladiator has survived. He has raised his finger. The crowd has called for missio. The editor has granted it. He's been helped off the sand, which may or may not have been treated with blood-absorbing minerals, depending on the day. He's going back to the loot. What happens next? So he's back. The crowd is already filtering out. The next bout is being arranged. The sand is being raked. The machinery of the spectacle moves on without him. He goes to the medics. The gladiatorial medical staff were, as mentioned, quite skilled for their era. They would clean and dress wounds, set broken bones, perform surgeries when necessary. The bone analysis from Ephesus shows evidence of healed fractures, healed blade wounds, and some fairly sophisticated surgical interventions. These men were being put back together and returned to service as efficiently as possible. Recovery time varied obviously. A minor wound might mean a few days of rest. A significant injury might mean weeks or months of careful treatment and rehabilitation. During that time, the gladiator was housed, fed, and monitored. Still an asset. Still a source of potential future income, just temporarily offline. The social world of the ludus during recovery is something we know relatively little about, but we can infer some things. There were relationships, there were hierarchies based on experience and fighting record. There were probably conversations, games, ways of passing time that we do have written records of because no one thought to write them down. There was also, occasionally, religious practice. Gladiators seem to have had their own devotions. There is evidence of a cult of Nemesis, the goddess of fate and retribution, having particular relevance to the gladiatorial community, which makes a certain amount of sense when you consider that a gladiator's life was very much at the mercy of forces beyond his control. The crowd's mood. The editor's decision, the particular quality of a day's opponent. Fate, in its most immediate and physical form, There were also Hermes, Mercury's gladiatorial counterpart, associated with both commerce and the passage between life and death, and Jupiter Dolichonus, for those from the eastern Mediterranean, and various personal protective spirits, household gods, whatever fragments of home religion a man might carry with him into a context that was very far from anything resembling home. The epitaphs are interesting on this point. Many gladiatorial epitaphs were paid for by fellow fighters, by colleagues, by the men who had trained alongside them and shared the strange enclosed world of the lute. They contain phrases like fellow fighter and barracks companion. They commemorate not just victory records, but personal qualities. These were people with relationships, loyalties, grief, and sometimes they fought each other. Two men who had eaten at the same table, trained under the same doctors, shared the same cramped quarters, scheduled to fight each other for a crowd that didn't know their names. The crowd wanted a good performance. The fighters understood what was actually happening. There's a gravestone from Rome 1st or 2nd century AD of a gladiator named Diodorus, which contains an inscription complaining that he was killed not by his actual opponent, but by treachery, possibly a referee's bad call, or a deliberate foul, suggesting that even within the professional context there was a sense of honor and its violations. They had codes. They had standards. They had things they thought weren't fair, which is all deeply human and slightly heartbreaking in the context of an institution built around their suffering. So let's say our gladiator keeps surviving, fight after fight after fight. He's good at this, unfortunately for him, because being good at it means he keeps doing it. At some point, after a sufficient number of fights, and there was no fixed number, it varied by era and by lanista and by the general mood of the establishment, a gladiator might be granted his freedom. Specifica G, he might be presented with the rudis. The rudis was a wooden sword. That's all it was, physically. A wooden practice sword, the kind used in training. But symbolically it was enormous. It meant you were done. It meant the obligation, whether it came from enslavement or from a sworn contract, was discharged. You were a free man, or at least something closer to one. The ceremony of receiving the rudis could happen in the arena, in front of the crowd, which gave it a theatrical quality entirely in keeping with the whole institution. The crowd who had watched you bleed and struggle and survive was now witnessing your release. It was a story with a kind of resolution. Rome liked those. But what did freedom actually mean? That depended heavily on who you were before you became a gladiator. If you had been enslaved, manumission gave you the status of a freedman or a freedwoman, which was a recognized category in Roman law. Freedmen had civil rights. They could own property. They could conduct business. They could not hold most political offices, but they could accumulate wealth, and their children, crucially, were born free citizens. If you had been a free man who voluntarily signed a contract with the discharge returned you to your previous status with whatever social complications came attached to having been a gladiator. And here we get to something genuinely interesting and a little bit uncomfortable. The legal and social status of gladiators in Roman society was deeply paradoxical. Gladiators were called infames in Roman legal terminology, which means, roughly, disgraced or of ill repute. They were in the same legal category as actors, prostitutes, and certain categories of criminals. They had fewer legal protections than an ordinary citizen. They could not testify in most court proceedings. They could not hold public office. Socially, they were both adored and contaminated. The crowd loved them. Women were rumored to be obsessed with them. Juvenal, the Roman satirist, wrote a scathing piece about a senator's wife named Epia, who ran off with a gladiator named who was scarred and aging and damaged from years of fighting. And somehow this was even more scandalous than if Sergius had been young and The point Juvenal was making was partly that gladiators had this inexplicable sexual magnetism that transcended rational sense. There is a whole academic literature on this subject, which I will summarize as Romans had complicated feelings about gladiators. They were simultaneously fascinating and beneath contempt. Their bodies were public property during their careers, and even afterward they carried the mark of that public ownership. So when the rudis was granted, and the former gladiator walked out of the arena, or the ludus, As a free man, he walked into a world that celebrated what he had done, while making very clear he was not quite a full member of respectable society, which created, as you might imagine, certain practical problems. Let us think practically about what a retired gladiator's options actually looked like in the 1st or 2nd century AD. First option, stay in the business. Just differently, many retired gladiators became doctors, training the next generation. This was a natural career transition. You had the skills. You had the experience. You had the authority that comes from having done the thing rather than just knowing about it theoretically. The pay was presumably better than fighting. The physical risk was lower, and you could continue to exist within the community that was the only community you'd known for years. This is where we get a lot of our gladiatorial knowledge, actually. The techniques and training methods that survived long enough to be written down or depicted in mosaics were almost certainly transmitted through these They were the institutional memory of the arena. Secondo option. Personal security work. Bodyguards. Essentially, wealthy Romans hired former gladiators as protection, which made obvious sense. These were men with verified combat experience and, crucially, professional discretion. The gladiatorial oath had included elements of absolute obedience to one's owner, and that culture of reliable service translated reasonably well to private security. Several notable Romans are recorded as having gladiatorial bodyguards. Julius Caesar had them. Augustus maintained a Germanic bodyguard unit that functioned similarly. The cultural weight of a gladiator standing behind you at a dinner party sent a message that did not require any words. Third option, if the former gladiator had managed to accumulate some money during his career, which was possible, since victorious gladiators received prizes, palm branches, and cash gifts from the editor of the games, he might invest in a trade or a small business. Freed gladiators appear in inscriptions as craftsmen, merchants, and minor property owners. The infamia designation limited certain activities, but did not prohibit economic participation generally. Fourth option, some became celebrities in a more sustained way, offering public demonstrations, participating in the social circuit of their city or town. Fame in the ancient world operated through personal presence, in a way it doesn't today. You couldn't stream a retired gladiator's workout routine, but you could attend a dinner where he was present as a guest of honor and tell people about it afterward. Fifth option, and this is the one most consistent with human nature across all historical periods. Some of them drank a lot and had a hard time adjusting to civilian life. We don't have direct testimony about this, because ancient sources were in the habit of documenting Lor's emotional struggles with the kind of detail we might want. But we have the structure of the situation, and the structure suggests that the transition from years of extreme physical routine, controlled environment, and very clear purpose to the open-ended uncertainty of private life would have been, to put it gently, a lot. Identity is a real thing. When your identity is built around one very specific and intense set of activities, and then those activities stop, you do not automatically become someone else cleanly, and you carry the old identity and try to figure out where to put it. The gladiators who turned down the rudies and kept fighting, like Flamma. It's worth wondering whether that choice was always purely about financial security or fame, whether some of them simply didn't know how to be anything other than what they'd been made into. That's a quiet tragedy. Not dramatic, not arena-sized. Just a man with a wooden sword he didn't ask for, standing at the edge of a life he wasn't prepared for. Let's talk about some actual historical gladiators, whose stories we can trace with reasonable confidence, because abstract sociology is well and good, but people are more interesting than categories. We've mentioned Let's dwell on him for a moment. Syrian-born, which suggests he may have been a war captive or sold into slavery from the eastern provinces. He fought in the 2nd century AD, during the reigns of Hadrian or Antoninus Pius, most likely. His epitaph, found in Sicily, reads in part, 34 fights, 21 victories, 9 draws, 4 losses. Received the rudies 4 times. Died at 30. He died at 30. Despite surviving 34 professional fights, despite being offered freedom multiple times, he died in the arena, which is the only conclusion that makes sense, given the record. Not to a theatrical villain, not in a particularly storied moment we have details of, but as a working fighter, in his 30s, doing what he'd kept choosing to do. The 9 draws is worth noting. A draw in gladiatorial combat, the sign missione opposite of a decisive outcome, meant both fighters had performed well enough that the editor granted both Missio and the crowd departed satisfied rather than bloodthirsty. These were tactical, technical fights, where skill was being demonstrated rather than just violence administered. Flamma was clearly a craftsman of his profession. Then there's a gladiator who rose to prominence during the reign of Nero, which is significant because Nero's relationship with gladiators was intense and personal in a way that tells us quite a lot about both Nero and Roman celebrity culture. Nero loved gladiators. More specifically, he gifted Spiculus with houses and wealth at a level typically reserved for men of much higher status. He publicly honored him in ways that made traditionalist Romans uncomfortable, because one of the things Infamia was supposed to do was prevent this kind of status elevation. Nero was not particularly concerned with traditional Roman sensibilities, which is either his most interesting quality or his most infuriating one, depending on who you ask. Spiculus, by all accounts, was just very good at what he did. He was a famous fighter, well liked by the crowd, and Nero's patronage elevated him to a kind of semi-official celebrity. He appears in sources as someone who moved in imperial social circles to a degree unusual for his profession. And then Nero fell. In 68 AD, as the political situation collapsed and Nero lost support, as the army turned against him and the Senate declared him a public enemy, Nero apparently asked for Spiculus to come to him. He wanted his famous gladiator to be with him at the end. Whether this was about protection, or company, or some need for someone specifically loyal when everyone else had left, we can't say with certainty. Spiculus didn't come, or couldn't come. The sources vary. Nero ended up dying in a very undignified and not particularly gladiatorial manner, which, given the theatrical absurdity of his entire reign, is somewhat fitting. Spiculus disappears from the historical record after Nero's fall. What became of him? We don't know. The patron who had elevated him was gone. The houses and wealth might or might not have been seized in the political chaos that followed. He might have gone back to fighting. He might have retired. He might have had a quiet life in a provincial town somewhere that no one thought to write about. The absence of record is its own kind of story. Then there's Spartacus, who I mention here not primarily as a gladiatorial survivor story, but as the most famous gladiator in all of history, whose survival narrative took a very different shape than most. Spartacus was, by most accounts, a Thracian, possibly a former soldier or auxiliary, which would explain his later military competence. He was enslaved and ended up at the Capuan ludus of Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus, which is a mouthful of a name for a man whose school became historically famous largely because his gladiators escaped from it. The escape was in 73 BC. Spartacus and about 70 fellow gladiators broke out of the school, armed themselves, recruited enslaved workers from the surrounding countryside, and began the rebellion that Rome would spend 2 years suppressing, the Third Servile War. The largest slave revolt in Roman history, led by a gladiator. What the Spartacus revolt tells us is that the gladiatorial institution, for all its careful management of inmates' physical needs, could not fully contain the human desire for that the men in those schools understood what had been taken from them, and that given the right conditions and leadership, they would take it back. Spartacus's eventual fate is not clearly recorded. He died in battle in 71 BC during the final engagement with Crassus's legions. His body was not found, which means he didn't survive in the end. But he also didn't get the symbolic defeat Rome might have preferred. The captured rebel displayed in chains or executed publicly. He just vanished into the chaos of a battlefield. The 6,000 enslaved people who survived the battle and were captured were crucified along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, which is a detail that sits very heavily in the middle of any discussion of Rome's relationship to its gladiatorial and enslaved population. Rome did not forget what Spartacus had done. For generations afterward, another Spartacus was a shorthand for the thing Rome feared most about its own foundations, that the people it had built its empire on might remember that they were people. We have to talk about Commodus. There's no way to have this conversation without him. Commodus was emperor of Rome from 177 to 192 AD, following his father, Marcus Aurelius, who was, by all accounts, a very serious and thoughtful man who wrote philosophy in his spare time and tried hard to be good. The contrast between father and son is the kind of thing that makes historians sigh heavily and stare at the ceiling. Commodus was, to put it diplomatically, not Marcus Aurelius. He was obsessed with gladiatorial combat, not as a spectator, which would have been normal, but as a participant. He fought in the arena, regularly, with great theatrical commitment and essentially no risk, because no sane Roman gladiator was going to seriously injure the emperor, because they would like to continue breathing. So Commodus got to have the experience of being a gladiator. The costume, the crowd, the physical performance, the identity, without the actual danger that had defined the lives of every real gladiator who had ever entered the arena. He also had an interesting approach to hunting in the arena that involved him shooting at animals from a raised platform so they could unreach him, and then acting as though he was being terrifically brave. The Roman public, to their credit, found this both ridiculous and slightly worrying. Commodus renamed himself Hercules, e renamit Rome Colonia Commodiana, which Commodiana is a name that no city deserves. He had himself depicted as Hercules in sculpture, wearing a lion's skin and holding a club, which were details. That worked a lot better on Hercules than on Commodus, who had the kind of soft, well-fed face that suggests a life of banquets and insufficient sleep. The Senate hated him. His advisors frequently tried to manage him, and occasionally feared for their lives. He executed people he found threatening or annoying with a casualness that made everyone around him perpetually nervous. What does this have to do with gladiatorial survivors? Everything, actually, because the real gladiators who fought in the arena during Commodus' reign had to navigate the bizarre situation of an emperor who thought he was one of them, who invaded their professional identity without any of the experience that had made that identity, who wanted the symbolism without the substance. The chariot driver, Clender, a freedman who had become one of Commodus's closest advisors, was at one point prefect of the Praetorian Guard. A former enslaved person, an actual freedman navigating real power, and yet the man above him was playing gladiator while Clender did the actual governing. Rome under Commodus was a place where the symbolic had almost entirely eaten the real. When an emperor performed combat and called himself Hercules, while actual fighters, with actual scars, tried to live their actual lives in the margins, Commodus was eventually assassinated in 192 AD, which came as a relief to essentially everyone, including his wrestling partner Narcissus, who was recruited as the actual executioner after a poison attempt failed. He was strangled in his bath. Not gladiatorial, not heroic, rather fitting. In the end, here is something that tends to produce genuine surprise. Female gladiators existed. They were not common, they were not central to the institution, but they existed. And they fought in Roman arenas, and they have been mostly written out of the story in ways that say something about how history tends to get remembered. They were called gladiatresses, or sometimes simply mulares, women, fighting in the arena context. The Roman writers who mention them are generally disapproving, which tells us something. Juvenal references female gladiators as evidence of Roman moral decline. Cassius Dio mentions female gladiatorial contests during the reign of Domitian. There is a relief sculpture from Halicarnassus, now in the British Museum, depicting two female gladiators named Amazon and Achillea, both in fighting stances, both with swords drawn. It appears to be a commemorative piece, marking a particularly good fight between them that ended in a draw and mutual discharge. Both names are stage names, in the way that many gladiatorial names were stage names, professional identities taken on when entering the arena. What do we know about their lives? Less than we know about male gladiators, and we already don't know enough about them. The sources are fewer. The archaeological evidence is sparser, and the cultural framework in which female gladiators operated was even more paradoxical than the one surrounding their male counterparts. A free Roman woman who fought in the arena was doing something that violated almost every expectation of Roman female life. Respectable Roman women were supposed to be modest, domestic, shielded from public exposure, appearing in the arena as a fighter, a body for public viewing. Performing violence was about as far from respectable as it was possible to get, and yet, Some of them seem to have been free volunteers. Some of them were apparently skilled enough to have commemorative reliefs. Some of them had drawn fights that ended in honors. Domitian eventually banned female gladiatorial combat around 96 AD, which is interesting because it suggests it was common enough that banning it meant something. You don't issue prohibitions against things that aren't actually happening. The female gladiators, having survived both their fights and the general indifference of historical record, disappear from our view more thoroughly than their male counterparts. They were there. They fought. They bled and won and lost, and some of them survived. The rest is silence, which is its own story. We've spent a lot of time thinking about the gladiators themselves, but the story of gladiatorial survival is also the story of the crowd's relationship to that survival, because the crowd's opinion was literally life or death. Roman attitudes toward the arena were not monolithic. This is important. It's very easy to imagine the Roman crowd as a single bloodthirsty entity, and some of them were some of the time. But Rome also had its critics. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher and advisor to Nero, a combination that must have produced spectacular internal conflict, wrote about attending gladiatorial games and being disturbed by them. His discomfort wasn't primarily about the violence. Interestingly, it was about what the crowd's behavior revealed about human nature. The ease with which ordinary people were drawn into cruelty when the context made it social and normal. He found it more disturbing to watch people enjoying the spectacle than to watch the spectacle itself. Marcus Aurelius, when forced to attend games as part of his imperial duties, brought paperwork. He worked through his correspondence and administrative documents while the arena did its thing below him, which is either an admirable display of principled disengagement or the most passive-aggressive response to a social obligation in Roman history. Possibly. But Augustine of Hippo, writing from the Christian perspective of the late Empire period when gladiatorial games were declining, tells a story about his friend Alypius, who was dragged to the arena by friends and tried to keep his eyes closed. But at a moment of crowd noise, he opened them reflexively, saw the blood, and was immediately hooked. He became a regular attendee. Augustine uses this story as evidence of human weakness, the argument being that even good people with good intentions could be corrupted by a sufficiently intense environmental pull. The crowd at the arena was not simply the arena. It was Rome's entire population compressed into tiers of seating arranged by social class, with women relegated to the top, free citizens in the middle, elites in the front, and the whole architecture designed to reinforce hierarchy, even while everyone was watching the same thing. The seating told you who you were. The event below told you what Rome was. And when the crowd roared for Missia, for the life of a fighter who had performed honorably, and well, they were exercising a genuine power. Real power with real consequences. For a population with very limited formal political participation, that moment of collective influence over life and death was perhaps one of the few arenas, literally, where they could feel it. The gladiator who raised his finger and survived did so partly because of his own skill, and partly because thousands of strangers decided, in that particular moment, to beam. That's a strange kind of community, a strange kind of belonging. But it was one of the ways that gladiatorial survivors in the Roman public were connected across an enormous social distance. Nothing lasts forever, including institutions built on human suffering. Gladiatorial games declined and eventually ended. And the story of how and why tells us something about both Rome and about how societies change. The decline was gradual, not sudden. There was a moment when someone declared gladiatorial combat over, and the sand was swept up, and the Colosseum was converted into something else. It was more like a long, slow drift, driven by a combination of factors that overlapped and influenced each other across a couple of centuries. Christianity is part of the story. As the Christian population of the empire grew and eventually achieved imperial patronage under Constantine in the early 4th century, Christian writers and thinkers pushed back against the games on moral grounds. The gladiator, as infamous as disgraceful, was compatible with Christian categories in a way, but the games as a whole, the spectacle of death for entertainment, increasingly read as incompatible with the Christian empire's self-presentation. Constantine issued edicts limiting gladiatorial games in 325 AD. They weren't abolished outright, but they were restricted, and their social prestige began to erode. The economic stress of the later empire also played a role. Gladiatorial games were expensive. The infrastructure required the schools, the trainers, the equipment, the medical staff. The organization of bouts required sustained investment. As Rome's economic situation deteriorated and the political situation became increasingly complicated in the 3rd and 4th centuries, that investment became harder to sustain, and the populations that had traditionally fed the gladiatorial system were captives from successful Roman conquests were becoming scarcer as Roman military expansion slowed and reversed. Gladiatorial contests appear to have continued in some form into the early 5th century. The traditional endpoint given by historians is 404 AD, when the monk Telemachus allegedly jumped into the arena to stop a fight and was killed by the crowd, prompting the emperor Honorius to abolish gladiatorial contests in response to the martyr's death. It's a very tidy story. It might even be true. Ancient sources, again, deserve some skepticism, but it has the quality of a symbolic end, which history sometimes actually provides. What filled the arena space afterward? Animal hunts continued for some time. Chariot racing had always been the other great spectator sport of Rome, and it continued. Theater. Public executions in various forms. The Colosseum itself continued to be used for various purposes for centuries. The gladiators, as an institution, were simply done. The Lastones, whoever they were, whatever their records, whatever their names, finished their careers into a world that no longer had an organized professional arena waiting for their successors. Here's where we have to be honest about the historiography, because this is a history channel and honesty about sources is one of the things we do, even when it slightly deflates the clean narrative. Most of what we know about gladiators comes from 4 types of sources: literary texts, inscriptions and epitaphs, artistic depictions, and archaeological evidence. Each has its limitations. Literary texts were almost entirely produced by educated, upper-class Roman men who viewed gladiators from a considerable social and physical distance. They tell us what gladiatorial combat meant to Romans of that class. They tell us the cultural frame. They are much less reliable on the daily lived experience of fighters themselves. When Juvenal writes about women running off with gladiators, he's writing satire designed to make his audience feel superior. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it means we're getting it through a very specific lens. Inscriptions and epitaphs are closer to the gladiators themselves. Some were self-commissioned by fighters who could afford them. Some were commissioned by colleagues or companions. Some were dedicated by Laneste or by patronesses. Yes, women did commission gladiatorial epitaphs, which is charming in its way. These give us names, records, places of origin, ages at death, and occasionally small personal details. They're invaluable, but they survive unevenly. The Ephesus cemetery has given us a remarkable collection. Individual inscriptions survive from across the empire, but what we have is a sample, not a complete record. And the sample overrepresents those who died in or near major cities with better preservation conditions. Artistic depictions, mosaics, pottery, graffiti, sculptural reliefs show us equipment, fighting positions, crowd scenes, moments of decision. They're visual records created for various purposes, from expensive commissioned works to someone scratching a fighter's name into a wall because they were a fan. They're useful, but they require interpretation. Archaeological evidence has become increasingly sophisticated. The Ephesus Gladiatorial Cemetery Study, published in the early 2000s, used isotope analysis, bone structure analysis, an examination of wound patterns to reconstruct diet, origin, health histories, and cause of death for a significant sample of gladiators. It confirmed some things the literary sources suggested, complicated others, and opened new questions. The study found evidence that some Ephesus gladiators had been killed by a blow to the head from a specific angle, consistent with a standardized finishing blow delivered from behind, suggesting that the killing stroke in gladiatorial execution had a specific form and technique, delivered professionally and deliberately, which is a very dark piece of data presented very calmly in an academic paper. What we know about gladiatorial survivors specifically is largely inferential. We know fighters had long careers. We know some received the rudies. We know some became trainers. We know some achieved significant fame and social mobility. We know some, like Flamma, declined freedom and fought until they died. What we don't know is what the majority of them felt, what they dreamed about, what they told each other in the evenings, what they missed, what they were glad to be done with, and what they quietly mourned when it was over. History gives us the bones and the records. The texture of daily experience, the part that would fill out a life into something recognizable, is mostly gone, which is true of all ancient history. But it feels particularly acute here, with a population of people whose physical lives we know in some detail their injuries, their diets, their fighting records, but whose inner lives are largely inaccessible. They were people, fully, completely people, in a context that often worked very hard to make them something else. It's late now, and we've covered a lot of ground, from the funeral rites of early Rome to the last fights of the late Empire, from Spartacus breaking down the school walls to Flamma turning down his freedom 4 times, from Commodus playing dress-up to the female gladiators whose names survive on a relief in the British Museum. The story of gladiatorial survival is ultimately the story of what happens when a society builds an institution around certain people as bodies, and then has to figure out what to do when those people persist, when they survive the thing designed to consume them, when they stand at the edge of freedom, wooden sword in hand, and find that the world waiting for them has been shaped by the same systems that produced the arena. Some of them found their way. They trained younger fighters. They ran small businesses. They became bodyguards or merchants or quiet provincial figures who told stories at dinner that no one else at the table could top. Some of them stayed in the only life they knew, because it was the only life they knew, and some of them, like Flamma, kept fighting into their 30s, fight after fight, until the day the number didn't go up anymore. There's no triumphant ending to the gladiatorial story. There is no moment where Rome looked at what it had built and felt the appropriate degree of shame. The games ended gradually, for economic and political and religious reasons. Not because Rome had a moral awakening about the humanity of the people in the arena, but the gladiators themselves, the individual men and women whose epitaphs still surface, whose names still appear in inscriptions, whose bones still tell stories to researchers with the right equipment. They were just people trying to navigate an impossible situation with whatever tools they had, which is, if you think about it, what most people in most eras have done, and that's both the most ordinary thing in the world and worth staying awake for, at least for a little while. All right, that's enough for tonight. You can close your eyes now, if you want. We've been to the arena and back, and everyone is rested and accounted for. Thanks for spending the evening with a sleepless historian. Sleep well. Sleep well. We'll find something else to gently ramble about next time. Good night.
Today we will talk about a very old history topic. This story is from a time when there were no house, no cities, no schools and no books. This is the story of fire. Fire is not just a thing but that burns. Fire changed everything. Fire made human different from animals. Without fire, there would be no food like today, no protection, no progress, and maybe no modern world. This is the story of how fire slowly changed human life step by step. Long, long ago, humans were very weak. They had no clothes, no proper homes, and no weapons. They lived in forest and open land. They were always afraid. Big animals hunted them, cold weather hot there, dark nights scared them. Human ate raw food. Raw meat was hard to chew. Raw plants were bitter and dangerous. People got sick easily. Many people died young. Life was very hard. The first time humans saw fire. Yes, fire was not first made by human. Fire came from nature. Lighting heat trees, volcanoes burned land, dry forest caught fire. Early humans saw fire from far away. They saw bright light. They felt heat. At first, they were scared. Fire was dangerous. Fire burned skin. Fire destroyed trees. But humans are curious. They watched fire carefully. Slowly, humans understood something important. Fire is dangerous, but fire is also useful. Fire give heat, fire give light. People start keeping fire interested of running away. They carried burning wood from natural fire. They portrayed that fire carefully. If fire dead, life became hard again. Fire became like a friend. Fire and warmth. Cold weather was deadly before fire. Winter killed many people. People slept at night. Fire changed this. Fire kept human warmth and people could live in a colder place. They could travel to new lands. Fire helped humans survive winter. This was a very big change in history. Fire and light. Before fire, night was very dark. Darkness brought fear. Wild animal hunted at night. Fire brought light. People could see at night. They could stay together. They could talk and think. This helped humans before social. This helped humans share idea. Fire created community. Fire and protection. Fire scared wild animal. Animal we are afraid of flame. They stayed away from fire. Humans used fire as protection. They slept near fire. This saved many lives. Fire became a side. Fire and cooked food. This was one of the biggest change in human history. Yes, human learned to cook food. Cooked meat was soft. Cooked plant were safe. People became stronger. Their brains grew bigger. Good food gave more energy. Scientists believe. Cooking helped human become intelligent. Fire helped create the human brain. Fire and tools. Fire helped humans make tools. They hardened wood in fire. They shaped stone using heat. Later, fire helped me melt metal. This lead to copper tools. They bronze tools. They iron tools. Fire started technology. Fire and caves. Human lived in caves. Caves were dark and cold. Fire made caves livable. Fire kept animal away. Fire gave light inside cave. Human painted on cave walls using firelight. This was early art. This was early culture. Fire and social life. Fire brought people together. People sat around fire, they talked, they shared stories. This was the beginning of language, this was the beginning of tradition. Fire created human society, learned to make fire. At first, human protected natural fire. Later, they learned to make fire. They rubbed stones, they rubbed wood. This was a huge discovery. Now fire was always available. Human we are no longer dependent on nature. This was the freedom. Fire and migration. Fire allowed humans to move. They went to good lands. They crossed mountains. Fire helped humans to spread across the world. From Africa to Asia, from Asia to Europe, from Europe to everywhere. Fire helped humans conquering that plant. Fire and religion. Fire became scared. People believe fire was a magic. People worshipped fire. Yes, many religions used fire. Fire rituals started. Fire became a symbol of life. Fire and farming. Fire helped clear forest. People burned land. This made farming possible. Yes, farming changed human life. People settled down. Villages formed and cities were born. Are you know? Fast start civilization. Fire and industry. Thousands of years later, fire powered machine, fire boiled water, steam and gas were born. Factors started, trains moved, fire became energy. Fire and modern world. Today, fire still help us. Electric comes from fire. Cooking or users use fire. Industries uses fire, and fire still saves human life. Conclusion: fire is not just that the fire is the history. Fire made humans human. Without fire, there would be no civilization, no cities, no technology. Fast is the greatest discovery in human history. This, thank you. Today, now this is a very interesting story. I am feeling very relaxed now because I am try to very best now to please subscribe, like, and comment. Thank you.